Welcome to the final week of our course. We're going to be talking about decision theory. This is sort of, well, it touches on some aspects of philosophy, so we haven't covered any logic in this course, but it touches on that, on sort of uh, what is good reasoning, right? Uh, what are types of reasoning that are uh, that ensure sort of true conclusions, right, from good premises. And rather than, you can take a logic course, so rather than give you sort of a primer in symbolic logic, I thought I'd jump to uh, an account of reasoning that's really actually very useful in your everyday life. It involves a little bit of minimal math and some concepts. You may find it a little tough at first, but I don't think it's too tough. And the payoff, I think, is huge, right? If you learn to apply decision theory to decisions in your life, you can really avoid some sort of pitfalls that we commonly fall into in reasoning, right? Our brains are pretty impressive, right? But we do operate according to sort of certain little heuristics, and we often make actually sort of worse decisions without thinking rigorously about our decisions. So I'm hoping this is something that you can carry with you, right? At least in principle, even if you walk away and you don't remember every detail, right? But at least hopefully you'll be given the impression that, hey, there exists, right, a rigorous way of making decisions. And then later in life, if you think about it again, you can always go back to these chapters and apply it in your life. It can make you rich, right? Like it's most people don't think this way, right? And you think carefully about all the decisions you make, be it an investment or what school you choose or whatever, who you marry. Um, it can pay off. It will give you a big leg up on other people out there in the world. So I'm beginning sort of with the premise. I've we covered some philosophy of science when we focused on laws of nature. We didn't get into sort of uh, science obviously does give us information, right, through propositions about the world or propositions that are at least very, very likely true. Um, so we didn't get into how you could evaluate scientific research, but you get this stuff all the time. And by and large, if it's been, peer reviewed in the journal and then reported in the media, it's largely true, right? It's largely trustworthy. There is some, particularly when it gets to the popular media, you really have to be careful about, um, stuff. For example, right? So, uh, sweet and low, right? Saccharin, it's been shown in mice, right? In lab rats or mice, I forget which, right? If you stuff them full of saccharin, like an incredible amount, statistically more of them will develop tumors in their bladders, right? Cancerous tumors. There is definitely some causal relation there, right, between sweet and low and bladder cancer. Um, that gets reported in the news media, right? It might be you might walk away thinking, oh, I'm guaranteed to get bladder cancer if I use saccharin or something like that. And that's not really a message you should take away, right? So if it's a good article, it will sort of report a little bit of the data, right? Like the percentage of rats, right? The effectiveness of the causal relation, right? Um, and it turns out that there is a causal relation, but not what we call a particularly effective one, right? So it increases the probability of bladder cancer, but not by a huge amount. So that information alone is not sufficient for you to make a decision. There are lots of other factors that factor into your decision, right? It is useful, like this kind of information is great. You should definitely use it to guide your decision. But we're starting right with that assumption that, yeah, you can get scientific information, right, that's more or less reliable if you're careful about reading it. And now in this lecture, we're going to learn, in the next one, learn how to apply that information to decisions, right? Because um, what if there are important benefits to saccharin for you, right? And those benefits may, in some ways, outweigh, right, the slightly increased risk of bladder cancer, right? Um, I mean, maybe you are, right, 85, right, and you figure you've got, a few years left anyways, and you don't particularly care. You're not really sort of like worrying about cancer too much at that age. So there's all kinds of factors, right, that can factor in. So your decisions for your life um, involve the information about the world you get from science, and then also your various values, and then they can be all applied rigorously in a sort of a decision matrix to give you the best choice to make. So that's where we're going to give you a model of decision making that takes in all the factors into account, not just the information about the world, right? Um, Typically, right, these decision-making models often use sort of hypothetical games as models. They're useful, so we're going to do that as well. Uh, we're going to simplify it first, right, and say, okay, our decision-making model, we're just going to use a game that involves pulling colored marbles out of a jar, right? So here's a jar, and it's got red marbles, blue marbles, and green marbles. Right? And the game just is you pull a marble out at random, and you're going to bet on which color you're going to pull out, right? So you've got three options here, right? And the options are you can bet on red, bet on green, or bet on blue. So there has to be more than one option for this to count as a decision, right? If there's only one option, you're not making a decision. There's no choice to be made. Um, in our particular model for this game, we're going to say you can only choose one option, right? And those options are what we say call mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So exclusive sort of just means that if you choose one, you can't choose the others, right? So maybe you could make it. Let's allow that you could make slightly more complicated bets, like bets that the color you pull will be red or green, right? Um, okay, that's a bet you could make, right? And the probabilities will change as opposed to picking red or green, you'd have a greater probability of winning than a bet that just says picking red, right? Like if you ever played horse races, right? You can bet on a horse to win, or you can also bet on it to place, which means you're betting it'll either come in first or second, right? So you can make that sort of bet, but what you can't make is a bet that it'll either be red or green and it'll be red, right? Why? Because the second bet is included in the first bet, right? The first bet covered the possibility that it comes out red. So those aren't even distinct bets. So in a sort of a strictly logical sense, um, that sort of bet is impossible, right? In our games. So that's what we mean by exclusivity. And then by exhaustive, we just mean um, red, blue, and green are the only options, right? You're not pulling out any yellow marbles. So we've got options, right? This is one sort of variable, right? The different bets. And then states of the world are another variable, right? So you'll see on the left of this matrix, we have our various options. And on the top, we have states of the world. So the possible states of world in our game are you draw a red marble, you draw a green marble, or you draw a blue marble, right? So always be careful to distinguish states of the world from options, right? So for example, winning and losing, right? Oh, I win, I lose. That's not a state of the world, right? Because that in part depends on which color you bet on, right? So you want to make sure those are clearly distinct. Options are the bets you make. The states of the world are what actually ends up getting drawn. And the states of the world also need to be exclusive and exhaustive. And so our outcomes then are all the possible states of the world, right, combined with our options. So uh, right? All the outcomes that could happen. I might bet on red and red might be drawn. That's one, right, outcome, possible outcome. I might bet on red, but green gets pulled. That's another possible outcome, and so on, right? So that the number of outcomes, possible outcomes, is just going to be you multiply the left column times the top column, right? So here 3 times 3, and we get 9 possible outcomes, right, in our game. 3 of those outcomes are winning outcomes, right? So bet on red and red is drawn, bet on green and green is drawn, bet on blue and blue is drawn. The other 6 options, or the other 6 outcomes, rather, are losing outcomes. So let's focus on one of the winning outcomes, betting on red when red is drawn. Right? An important factor that we've left out, right? The reason you would be interested in playing the game at all is how much you might stand to win or lose, right, given some outcome. Uh, this is what we call the value that we assign to the different outcomes. And these values don't have to be monetary. In these simplified versions, it's useful, right, to just use monetary outcomes. We all value money. So it's the assigning of a value, right, along with the assumption that as a human you would like to maximize the value, right? You want more of the things that you desire. Um, that gives you a reason to actually choose an option, right? Until there's values, who cares? It's not even in. Okay, so how do we assign the values then? One way is simply to rank the outcomes in a list, right? So you can just choose which outcome you prefer to other outcomes, and you could rank all 9, right? However many are in your matrix, right? This is certainly enough, right, to provide a basis for choosing an outcome, but it's not quite as informative as you might like. One important thing it leaves out is how much better one outcome is than another, right? If you just rank them, it might turn out that the gap between your second favorite and your third favorite is like really wide, and the gap between fourth favorite and your fifth favorite is like they're almost equal, right? So you can't necessarily assume that your second preference is twice as good as your fourth, or something like that, if you got a ranking. Um, to be able to make those sorts of inferences about how much more you prefer one outcome than the other, you need to apply a measure to those values, money being a standard measure, right? So this is why we often use money in these sort of simple abstract versions. So, if your values are on a scale like that, a monetary scale, then yeah, we know that any outcome, right, that gives you $10 is twice as good to you as one that gives you $5. Um, you could also just assign numerical values to the outcomes, call those utilities, right? So in that measure, an outcome with a utility of 100 is twice as good as an outcome of 50, right? So, if the outcomes are whatever candy bars, right, and you prefer whatever Snickers to Mars bars, right, you could assign utilities to those, right, and that would also accomplish the same, assigning monetary values. Okay, so we're starting to see all the variables, right? We've got our options, we've got our outcomes, we got the values we uh, assign to those outcomes, we got the states of the world on top. Um, but your decision strategy also needs to incorporate this outside knowledge, right? This knowledge about and relationships between saccharin and bladder cancer and so on. But given a certain particular decision problem, right, some information is going to be relevant, some isn't. We may know a lot, right, about the possible states of the world and the probabilities of their occurring. We might know very little, right? And in each case, we have, right, rigorous strategies for making decisions depending on how much knowledge you have in a given case. So there are 3 basic types of decision making depending on how much information you have about the states of the world. Um, One, the first we call decision making with certainty, right? Um, this almost never happens in real life, right? In fact, the scientific method never actually allows us to conclude with total certainty that a hypothesis is true, right? Um, it's always possible that our theories could be falsified. That's what makes them scientific theories. Um, but in everyday decisions, right, we can definitely treat some hypotheses as effectively certain, right? Like, um, I'm pretty sure the theory of gravity, right, is going to be true and apply in all of my everyday situations, right? And also, in these artificial games, we can also set it up so that you have total certainty about certain states of the world, right? Um, so, for example, right, maybe we know that all the marbles in the jar are red, right? We can set that up that way. In that case, uh, this is not a gamble at all, right? All we need to do, but it's not necessarily automatically the case that you know which option to choose. Uh, it's going to involve calculating the values, right, of the outcomes, right? So even if you have all the information about the world, there's still little work to be done to maximize, right, your value or your utility. So let's suppose that the state of the world is such that we know red will be drawn. We have 3 options. Betting on red will make us $10. Betting on green will lose us $10, right? And this is just the values. Let's say that it's you walk Vegas, they have a new game, right, a marble pulling game, and these are just the outcomes. These are the monetary values they assign, right? The game is played. It's a little arbitrary, right? Okay, if we have inside information, right, and we know for sure that red is going to be drawn, um, then we look at our matrix, right, and we can see that betting on red will give us the highest value, right, the highest outcome. That's going to make us $10. If we know that red is drawn and we bet on green, that'll lose us $10, right? But again, we didn't know that immediately, right? A priori, we had to look at the values, right, and say, oh, okay, if I bet on green and they pull red, I lose $10, right? That's the way the game is played. So if we're in a situation of decision making with certainty, right, um, we can apply a strategy we could call the highest value strategy, which says, given that you have certain knowledge of the actual state of the world, right, choose the option associated with the highest valued outcome compatible with that known state. And that's just what we're doing here. We know the state is red is drawn, so we look at the options, and the one with the highest value is bet on red. That's plus 10. We're looking at the left column here. The other two are minus 10. Notice in that case, we didn't even really need the whole matrix, of course, but very few real life cases are like this, right? Obviously, this isn't even a very good game, right? Or it's not really a gamble, or like this is basically cheating, right? At the game, if you know you got inside information. If everybody knew the states of the world, then they wouldn't have this game, right? So there's almost always some uncertainty in real life, right? And so we need different strategies when we're dealing with different degrees of uncertainty. So the second possibility, right, of the sort of circumstances where you might be making decisions is decision making with complete uncertainty, right, where you have no idea which state of the world it contains, right? This is probably closer to what you'd be dealing with in one of these Vegas style games, right? So this is a bit of an idealization as well, right? Just as you very rarely know exactly what state of the world is going to obtain, it's also kind of rare that you have no information about what state of the world is going to obtain. But these two options sort of help us set up and walk through towards then the more sort of realistic. So even if we have no idea, right, that top row, which one of those is going to be true, um, there still are rigorous strategies for making decisions, even in those situations. So let's look at this table. Now the values are different than the last one, right? Let's suppose this is like a proper, like actual gambling game where we have no idea which color is going to be drawn, right? Um, but we do have information about the payoff, right, for each one, for the values of the different outcomes. We can still design a strategy, right, that will get us the best outcome possible, right, even if we have no information about the state of the world. So let's look at the various options, right? Compare betting on green and betting on blue, right? Well, if red is drawn, either way, it's the same outcome for green. And if we bet on green or we bet on blue, right? Either way, we lose $5. And likewise, if blue is drawn, right, we get the outcome if we bet on green or we bet on blue. We make $5 either way, right? But you'll notice that if we bet on green and green is drawn, we make $10, right? Whereas if we bet on blue and green is drawn, we only make 5. So green is always going to give you an outcome at least as good as blue. And it's also possible with green to get a better outcome, right? So we would say that betting on green is a better option than betting on blue. It can never, right? You can never lose more money than you would have betting on blue, and it's possible to make more. So here's sort of a rigorous definition of better option. So for any two options, A1 and A2, if there's at least one state for which A1 has a higher valued outcome, here it's bet on green, green is drawn, right? And there is no state for which A2 has a higher valued outcome than A1. And that's true, right? If we bet on blue, we're either equal to what we would have gotten if we bet on green or less, right? Then we can say option A1 is better than option A2. And you can apply, you don't need, right, monetary, you don't need what we call a measure applied, right? We can just use the ordinal ranked outcomes as well, and this definition will apply to those as well. If you ranked your outcomes. If A1 is better than A2, we can also say that A2 is worse than A1, right? If we've defined a better option, we've just also defined a worse. Now notice we do have another option here, right? So we decided that betting on green is better than betting on blue, and betting on blue is worse than betting on green. But we've also got red here. And betting on red is neither better nor worse than betting on green by our definition, right? So if you compare red to green, um, there are situations, right, where you're better off betting on green. There's other situations where you're better off betting on red. It's not clearly better um, than either of those, right? Um, but since there's certainly nothing to be gained by choosing a worse option, right? We can at least eliminate one option, right? We can eliminate betting on blue from our decisions, from our options here. So that's a good strategy, right? It deserves a name. We'll call it the eliminate worse options strategy, which says if any options are worse than some others, eliminate the worse options from further consideration. We can just rule out betting on blue, and now our options are betting on red and betting on green. This is sort of um, not so different from the right. If you ever taken the SAT, right, and you ever took a course on how to take the SAT, they say, right, cross out options and increase your odds of getting the right answer over and over, right. Always sort of rule out stuff that can't be right. So here we're sort of ruling out bet on blue, like just eliminate all the worst options. And now, if you're only choosing betting on red or betting on green, you got a better chance of winning. Now, given this better-worse relation that we've already defined here, we can also define the best option. So you have a best option if one option in a decision problem is better than every other option. That makes it the best one. That's sort of intuitive, I would think, which suggests a strategy, right? So best option strategy. If a decision problem contains a best option, choose it, right? Those situations may be rare, right? But when they come up, they can be easily solved, right? You absolutely know the choice to make, right? The option to choose, even if you have no information about which state of the world actually obtained. So none of these tables actually contain a best option yet, but I think it's clear enough what it means to have a best option. There are other kind of options that you might have reason to want to choose. So even if an option isn't the best option, sometimes it can be a good enough option, right? Uh, so what does that mean exactly? Well, suppose that there's some payoff that you would be satisfied with, right? And decide what is the lowest payoff that you would be satisfied with. That if you walked away with that outcome, you'd be like, okay, I'm fine, right? Well, if there was an option that guaranteed, right, at least that much payoff, right, then you could pick that and you're guaranteed to walk away happy, right? Um, so let's define these terms a little more precisely, right? So let's call a satisfaction level the minimum value or rank, if we're only ranking, right, the outcomes. So it's the minimum that the decision maker regards as a satisfactory payoff for a given decision problem. Call that the satisfaction level of that particular decision maker for that particular problem in question, right? It's going to differ person by person, right? So call a satisfactory option if every outcome associated with one given option has a value at least as great as the decision maker's satisfaction level for the decision problem, then that option is a satisfactory option for the decision maker in a given problem. So, for example, right, let's say you're playing this game and you're like, you know what, I'm just having fun. And like, if I can play this game, have some fun, and walk away breaking even, right, not losing money, I'd be happy. That would be a satisfactory, right, outcome for me. Well, look at their table here. Betting on red, the worst you can do is break even, right? You don't lose any money, right? So if you bet on red and blue is drawn, that's the worst outcome for betting on red, and it's zero. It's break even. You don't lose any money. You don't win any money, right? So if that makes you happy, then choose that option, right? And that's the strategy we'll see in the next slide. So call that strategy, the satisfactory option strategy, which just says if you got a decision problem and it's got no best option, but it does have a satisfactory option, choose the satisfactory, choose that option, right? So again, as we said on this table, betting on red is a satisfactory option if you're satisfied with breaking even, right? Um, Now, there might be more than one satisfactory option, in which case, then you can use a different strategy to choose among them. Maybe one will have like a higher possible payoff than the other, and you can choose that one, or maybe it doesn't matter and you just pick randomly between the two, right? So certainly possible to have more than one satisfactory option, but if there's at least one, right, you can pursue that strategy. Okay, so let's look at our table again, right? So this table has no best option, right? Um, you look at red in it's definitely the best outcome for red being drawn, right? But if green is drawn, you get nothing, whereas they're better, right? Green has a better outcome there. And if blue is drawn, you lose money, whereas if you had bet on blue, you would win. And you can go through those all those options and see that there's no best option, right? But if you're satisfied with zero as your outcome, right, there is a satisfactory option, and that is bet on blue, right? You look at the various outcomes, and the worst you can do with betting on blue is get zero, and the best you can do is win $5, right? So, and note, right, there, you can always find a satisfactory option if you can lower your satisfaction level enough, right? So if all the options, if the worst you could do was lose five, right, and you were happy with just losing $5, that's a fair enough cost for getting to play the game and having fun for a while. You said like, $5 admission fee, basically. That's fine. Okay, then that can be your satisfaction level, and you can find a satisfactory outcome, right? So that's certainly flexible as relative to the person, right? Um, so let's define some more terms. Call the security level of an option the lowest value, right? The lowest outcome associated uh, with that option. That's the security level. That's the worst you can do, right? Choosing that option. And so the option with the highest security level is going to be the option with the highest attainable satisfaction level, right? And that sort of suggests a general strategy, which we can call the play it safe strategy. You could also call it the maximum strategy, which is if you've got a bunch of options, just choose the option with the greatest security level, right? This basically is a strategy that says I want to minimize my losses, right? So I'm going to look at the options and see which one has the highest, the best worst case, basically, right? And choose that option. Um, and you could apply that strategy, right, to any game, right, any decision. Um, so this is generally sort of somebody that's risk averse that wants to minimize their losses, and they're not so worried about making right. They're not worried about making the most money, right? They're worried about not losing money, or at least losing as little as possible. Now you may have the totally right opposite approach, right? Maybe you don't care about minimizing your losses and you just want to shoot for the moon and maximize your potential gains, right? Then you could pursue the gambler's strategy, right? So certainly every value made drugs is going to have at least one highest valued outcome, right? It might have more than one equal, right? There might be two options where you win 10 or 100 or whatever. Um, for now, let's assume there's only one, right? Um, a gambler strategy would be to choose the option associated with the highest valued outcome, right? Not paying attention at all to how much you might lose. You call this the maximax, right? You're maximizing how much you could make. Um, and of course, if there is more than one outcome with the highest value, then you just look at the second highest values, take those into account, and so on, right? So, well, which should we do, right? Should we gamble or should we play it safe? These seem like diametrically opposed strategies that are both sort of like rational strategies relative to what your personality or something, right? So look at this table here, right? So the gambler strategy would say bet on green. Why? Because it pays off $10. Now, obviously, betting on red also pays off $10, right? That's the highest on the table. So then you look at the second next best value, and you see that betting on green could also pay off 5, whereas the next highest for red is 0, right? So if you're a gambler, you'd probably say bet on green, right? If you're playing it safe, you're going to want to bet on blue, right? Because there's no possibility of losing money. The worst you can do is break even. Um, is one strategy better than the other? Well, general consensus is no, right? It's up to your personality. It's up to the particular stakes of the particular decision, right? And your goals there. Um, so we sort of have begun to hit a wall here in decision making with complete uncertainty, right? But again, this was sort of an idealized situation. Typically, we have at least some information about the world, right? When we're not in Vegas. Even in Vegas, you actually have some information if you read up on like the probabilities of right various outcomes. Um, so once we have some information about the world, now we can actually make much more sophisticated decisions, right? And we have a lot more options. We call this situation, which is a situation we are usually in, decision making with risk, right? So decision making with risk is making decisions. Now it's not decision making with certainty. You don't know for sure, right, what state of the world you're going to end up in, but you do know how likely each state of the world is, right? And that gives you some idea then of how likely each outcome would be, right? Now, as it turns out, even in scientific studies, we don't even know with precision what the probabilities are, right? So really, we know with like some probability of certainty what the probability is, right? Um, let's take off that extra layer of complication there, right? Typically in science, the standard is like 95% certainty of the probability, right? But let's just say for now, we know for sure what the probabilities are. It won't affect um, your applying this to real life very much, right? If you get a scientific study and it says, oh, if you use saccharin, you've got X% chance of getting bladder cancer, right? The fact that that probability is actually only known with 95% certainty is you can largely ignore that extra little bit, right? Okay, we're assuming we know the probabilities, right? Um, Now, this sort of decision making, all the previous, right, types of decision making, it didn't matter if you were just using ranked outcomes or you were assigning a value to the outcomes. Um, Decision making under risk, you do have to assign a value to the outcomes. But we'll see towards the end of the lecture that there's a strategy for assigning values to ranked outcomes, right? Um, but for now, let's just use money. So suppose we're playing our same game, right? And we will, towards the end of this lecture and then much more in the next lecture, start using some more realistic decision problems, right? Because right now you may be worried this is fine for marbles and jars, but I will never play this game, right? How again? You promised that this would apply to my life. It will. We're going to get some more concrete situations, right? Even in this lecture, we'll see one. But for now, just go with me, right? Again, this is a simplified game to help you sort of get the concept. So let's suppose that you know that the jar contains 30% red marbles, 30% green, and 40% blue, right? This is not so different from the sorts of kind of knowledge you can have about Vegas, right? You can know the probabilities of right a given hand coming up in poker and craps or right blackjack, things like that. So let's suppose you know these for sure, right? The proportions of the marbles in the jar. So given that, what should you bet on? Should you bet on red? Well, we can make the decision rigorously. Um, we're going to need to talk about what we call expected value, right? So here's what we mean by expected value. Suppose that you were going to play this game a bunch of times, whatever, 100 times, 10, let's call it 10 times. So on average, right, if you're betting on red, if 30% of the marbles are red, that means if you bet 10 times, right, you're likely to win 3 out of those 10 times, right? Say call it 100 times. Definitely over the long run, right? If you're betting on red, um, you're going to win 30% of the time. Um, so let's suppose over 10 games, right? You play it 10 times, and you bet on red every time, and so 3 times out of those 10, you're going to win $10, right? Because that's the payoff for betting on red when red is drawn, right? And then 3 of those times you would get nothing, right? Because 30% of them are green, right? And the payoff for green is 0. And then 4 times you would lose $5 because 40% of them are blue, and the outcome for betting on red and blue being drawn is -5. So you can say over a bunch of plays, right, you're gonna level out into this sort of outcome, right? Um, if you did this over 10 times, you would net $10, right? You would make $30. Um, 3 times you would get 0, and then 4 times you would lose 5 for minus $20. And so you'd net $10 for playing 10 times. So on average, you're winning $1 per game if you're betting on red, right? And so we start out with it sort of hopefully it intuitively makes more sense that this would be the way it would work if you're playing a bunch of games, right? The probability you're going to approach the actual probabilities that there are in the jar, right? But you can do the same math for just playing one game, right? You just multiply each outcome by its probability. So betting on red, since there's again 30% red marbles, you say okay, 0.3 times $10 plus 0.3 times $0, right? Since there's 30% green marbles, plus 0.4 times -$5, right? Because there's 40% blue marbles, and you'll come up with $1, right? So that's the expected utility, the expected value, sorry, for betting on red in a single game, $1. In reality, any other things could happen, right? You might actually on any particular turn lose $5 or win $0, right? But over the long run, the expected utility is $1 per game. So this is how we can define expected value of an option. The expected value of an option is the weighted sum of the values of its possible outcomes. And what we mean by the weights, right, is the probability of the corresponding, right? So with this notion of expected value, we can now define a strategy for decision making under risk, which is the expected value strategy. That just says choose the option with the greatest expected value. So if you do that math for this whole table, it will turn out that betting on blue has the highest expected value, right? So we already figured out betting on red, right? That was $1 value. Figure it out for green and blue. Do it on your own, right? And it'll turn out that blue, right, has the highest. So if you're pursuing this strategy and there's a tie for greatest expected value, you could at least eliminate the other options, right? And you're only choosing between the two options with the greatest expected value. And then there you could just treat that now as a case of decision making under uncertainty and apply the strategies that we learned in that section. Right? Okay, so is this the best strategy, right? Is the expected value strategy the way to go in life? Let's look at this table, right? So betting on red has the lowest expected value, right? 3.5. Again, that just says sort of on average, right? Over 10 games, you're likely to win 350 per game, right? Whereas with betting on blue, right, it seems like you're likely to win an average of $7 per game, right? Now, again, on any given game, winning $7 is not an outcome, right? It's either going to be +5, +15, or -10, but it's just saying on average, right, you're going to win $7 a game betting on blue over the long time. Okay, so sorry, so did I say, so betting on blue has the highest expected value? Yeah, that's what I said. Betting on red has the lowest, but notice betting on red has the highest security level, right? And if you're only playing this once, right? If it's one of those decisions in life where you only get one try, um, you're not guaranteed, you're not going to get that $7 from betting on blue. You might lose 10, right? Um, So is it sort of irrational to want to just sort of play it safe and just bet on red, knowing that, worst case, you won't lose any money? Um, Maybe not. That's not necessarily irrational, right? It might be irrational if you were betting all day, right? To constantly bet on red. It seems like you trust that the expected value will occur if you're betting, playing all day and betting 100 times. It seems more rational to bet on blue and less rational to bet on red. But in, a big decision where you only get one shot, yeah, it makes sense sometimes to be risk-averse, right? It also might be the case, right, that raw dollar amounts don't quite capture an individual's values, right? So it's well known that money has declining marginal value. So if you're a billionaire, $10 means nothing to you, right? If you're a billionaire, $1,000 means nothing to you, right? Whereas if you're broke, right, $1,000 can pay your rent potentially, right? So yeah, the billionaire might be more rational to choose blue, right? Go for the highest expected value, and the broke person might be rational to choose red because, right, losing money is a bigger deal to them. Okay, so that's how you calculate, right, expected value, and that's how you make these decisions. We'll see them later applied to some actual decisions, but to do that, we need to talk a little bit about Frank Ramsey and his approach to assigning values to ranked outcomes, right? Because many of the sorts of decisions we make in life don't automatically have these values attached to them, right? So Ramsey gives you a method for assigning values so that you can then, right, apply these strategies for decision making under risk, right? So he talks about something called ethically neutral propositions. What that means is like it's something that could be true or false, and you have zero interest in whether it's true or false, apart from whether it has any effect on something else you do care about. So, for example, like rolling a dice and flipping coins, these are ethically neutral things, right? Um, if I'm flipping a coin and I'm not actually betting on it or flipping it for anything, I could care less whether it's heads or tails, right? But the reason we do flip coins is because we'll then attach another proposition to it that's not ethically neutral, right? Which is like, okay, heads, we eat tacos, right? Tails, we eat Thai food, and maybe I'm hoping we'll eat tacos, right? Or, if the coin lands heads up, I win $10, right? So this relationship between ethically neutral propositions and ethically not neutral propositions, he's going to use that later. So just get that in your head. Um, okay, so now you just rank your outcomes, right? That your preferences, right? And these are ones that you don't have values on them. These are ones that are not ethically neutral. These are outcomes you care about, and you have an order, right? A ranking of them, and you can rank them between values of 1 and 10. We'll show you how here. Between 0 and 1. We'll show you how. So the outcome you want the most, give that a value of 1. The outcome you want the least, give that a value of 0. And now for everyone in the middle, right, you can assign a value to it rigorously. This gets a little complicated, and it's I'm not going to test you on this, but just to walk you through it, this is like, again, you may come back to this in life, right? Um, so say, right, the options are, tacos, right, is number one. That's my favorite. That's my ideal outcome. The worst is Thai food. Say I'm with a group of friends, right, deciding what to eat. And somewhere in the middle is, right, pizza and gonna name another food, burgers. Okay. So um, again, tacos gets a value of 1, right? Thai food gets a value of 0. Um, and then pizza is my second choice. So how do I assign a value to pizza? Well, you do this, right? You say, when would I be indifferent between these two options? Either, right, getting pizza, being guaranteed pizza, or taking a gamble, right, with some probability that if I win would pay off with my first valued item, tacos, right? And if I lost, I would get my lowest valued Thai food, right? And there's going to be some probability assigned to that gamble, right? Do I have an 80% chance of winning? Do I have 50% chance of winning? 20% chance of winning, right? So whatever probability I assign to that sort of ethically neutral proposition, is it a coin flip? Is it a roll of the dice or whatever? So for example, if I say, look, pizza, um, I'm indifferent between getting guaranteed pizza or being able to flip a coin. And if it's heads, I get tacos. And if it's tails, I get my least favorite Thai food, right? I actually really like Thai food. I don't know why I randomly put Thai food at the bottom, because I ate it the other day. Um, but it was good. So that if I'm indifferent between, right, flipping a coin and getting either my highest or my lowest, and pizza, that means I assign a zero point 0.5, right, value to pizza. Um, we'll apply this again later in a concrete thing. And again, um, I'm not going to quiz you on this or whatever, but I do. Okay, so here's an actual example, right? Or hypothetical example, but a little closer to the sorts of choices we make in life, right? And a little, so I think, surprising the outcome, right? If you apply a rigorous decision strategy to it, right? So imagine we've got Kurt here. Kurt's a high school football player, and Kurt has been offered scholarships from two programs. Call one state university and call the other out-of-state university. So SU and OSU, right? So neither of these scholarships guarantees that he's going to play. He'll get into school. The school will be paid for, but he may sit on the bench the whole season. You don't know for sure, right? After doing a little research, Kurt estimates that if he takes a scholarship to OSU, he's got like a 75% chance that he'll get to play, right? Whereas if he takes a scholarship to SU, he's got about a 60% chance of getting to play, right? So here are his ranked preferences of outcomes. He would ideally like to attend SU and play football, right? His second choice would be to attend OSU and play football. Third choice would be to attend OSU and not play football. And fourth choice, attend SU and play football. So basically what that means is like Kurt, more than anything else, Kurt wants to play, right? So the two outcomes where he gets to play, right, are at the top, and SU's got the better team, right? But if he doesn't get to play, it seems like academically he prefers OSU, right? If he's not going to play, then OSU has the better academics, right? So that's basically the idea. That's how he's ranked these. So um, now we need to assign values to these and then apply our strategy. Okay, so we're applying Ramsey's method, right? So the top and the bottom on the ranking are easy, right? So we assign a value of 1 to attend SU and play football, and a value of 0 to attend SU and not play football, right? So now he's going to choose an ethically neutral proposition, right? That he's indifferent between, again, getting whatever intermediate ranked outcome with a probability of 1, and then this sort of gamble between the two other options, between the top and the bottom. So the way for him, right, the intermediate value, the second rank, attend OSU and play football. He says, if I roll a dice and I get a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, right, which is an 83% probability, right, I'd be indifferent between either getting guaranteed, right, to play football at OSU, my second choice, and this gamble between getting my first choice and my last choice, right, where I had an 83% chance of winning gamble. Um, so if the probability was any lower, right, if he had less than 83% chance to win the gamble, he'd just choose playing at OSU, right? Any higher, he'd take the gamble, but 0.83, he's indifferent. That's the idea. Um, so on Ramsey's method, attend OSU and play football gets a value of 0.83, right? Um, and you can run it again, right? And we end up with 0.25 for the third ranked option. Okay, so now that we have this figure, right, and we've got the complete matrix, right, we've got all the possible outcomes, um, and we've got the probability estimates for each, and then we've got the utility that we assign to each outcome, we can now calculate expected utility, right? So the way you do that is just take each option. So each option is associated with, right, two outcomes. So one option is attend SU, right, choose SU. Um, and there's two outcomes with you choose that OSU, you either play football or you don't, right? So the first one, so the expected utility of attending SU, we take the first option, multiply the probability times the utility, right? That's in the first parenthetical there, 0.6 times 1, right? And then we add that to the other possible outcome of attending SU, right, which is attending and not playing. So that's 0.4 times 0, right? And that is 0.6 plus 0, which is a expected utility of 0.6 for the attend SU option. And then we run it again for attend OSU, right? So um, The two possible outcomes are play football or don't play football. So that's on the second and third lines here. So 0.75 times 0.83 plus 0.25 times 0.25. You get 0.62 plus 0.06, and you get a utility of 0.68, right? So it turns out that if we apply the expected utility strategy and choose the option with the greatest expected utility, he should go to OSU, right? Um, that might be surprising, right? You wouldn't automatically know that unless you had applied, right, this strategy, right? Um, now again, right, like in the gambling situation, we're still averaging over an imaginary 100 times he would make that choice, right? In reality, only he gets one shot at this, and only one of those four outcomes will happen, right? So it's possible that if he does the expected utility strategy, he could end up with his third choice, right? I feel like the greatest, but um, that's maybe the difference between applying this in, um, right? You can apply this to decisions that are sort of more long term and repetitive, right? And decisions that are one time. But he's certainly guaranteed. It's it's definitely also if he's a maximin type of person, right? The reverse, then it seems like attending OSU is also the better, right? He's guaranteed not to get his worst outcome.